You're listening to Fresh Look with Hen Mazzig, presented by the Israel on Campus Coalition. Welcome to Fresh Look. This series will feature the pro-Israel movement's top voices to discuss today's incredibly complex and critical issues facing Israel and the Jewish community. For our first guest, we wanted to bring in someone who not only understands the ins and outs of Israeli politics, but who could connect them to the challenges in the diaspora. Michal Cotler-Wunsh worked her way up from an IDF recruit to a member of Israel's 23rd Knesset. Michal is also a human rights advocate who has inspired thousands around the world to stand up for justice and equality. It's a great honor to have Michal Cotler-Wunsh as our first guest.
Hi, Michal. How are you?
I'm good, Chen. How are you?
Good. It's such a pleasure to speak to you again. And we were just saying how the last time we met was over coffee in Tel Aviv, and we're now meeting virtually, which is very appropriate for the time we live in. So I want to dive in. Since the time of Herzl across the globe, people have been questioning the connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I know it's not the lightest thing to start with, but I think this is the gist of it. So I think we should just go straight there. And in your opinion, how can we set the record straight on the differences, if there is a difference, if there is a connection? What is your take on that?
So I think that we see very, very clearly the mutation of anti-Semitism, and we know it's of the most ancient hatreds that we are familiar with, an ancient hatred that has actually mutated according to the going paradigm of the time that it mutated to, right? Whether it be religion, whether it be race, and in this case, whether it be the mutation of anti-Semitism into what we know of as anti-Zionism. So the anti-Zionism of today is not random occurrence or mutation of anti-Semitism. It's a very intentional one. And if you look at the history of not only Zionism, and I have to say this, Zionism is a progressive national liberation movement. Its only fault is that it succeeded. And in many, many ways, it's an incredible inspiration to peoples around the world seeking national liberation in a progressive way. And the mutation of anti-Semitism, actually veering away from the older or ancient form of anti-Semitism into that anti-Zionism, has enabled a legitimate form of virulent hate that is targeting Israelis or Zionists and enabling in many ways to legitimize that ancient form of anti-Semitism that's considered illegitimate in a world that I think if Herzl saw today, he wouldn't be surprised at all. It is in fact what prompted him to write Alt-Neuland 120 years ago. We're about to mark 120 years of the recognition of the same kind of mutation of anti-Semitism that enabled then, at the time of the Enlightenment, and the understanding that even if Jews shed their identity, and now fill in the blank with Zionists, even if Zionists shed their identity, they cannot escape that virulent, mutated, ancient hatred.
Wow, that's very profound. And one of the I would say the places where anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is manifesting itself in the West now more in the clearest way is on college campuses. And I know you went to McGill, and this is a campus that is known for a lot of incidents of anti-Semitic incidents. And what do you make of the situation today compared to when you were a student and taught in McGill?
So I have to say something about university campuses. It's very, very interesting. Actually, part of my doctoral research tracked freedom of speech on university campuses and the way that the evolution and the regulation of speech on university campuses has impacted all kinds of things, including the anti-Semitism or the anti-Zionism we see on campus. It's a very long process, Chen. We didn't arrive here, at this sudden moment. And you're right. I would say that if we wanted to track how we got here, I would begin with 1917, the Balfour Declaration, 1921, the San Remo Conference, 1948, the Declaration of the State of Israel, and a series of physical wars wars that we can imagine with airplanes and tanks, 1948, 56, 67. And then an understanding that there is another kind of war that weaponizes international law and human rights, begins with the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution at the UN, continues with the 2001 conference in Durban against racism, which becomes an anti-Semitic hate fest, and actually basically is the beginning of what we know of as Israel Apartheid Weeks on campuses throughout North America, including at the time that I was at McGill. And I'll tell you that the understanding of those Israel Apartheid Weeks, without a question mark above that, sort of synonymous Israel is apartheid, which is just this, younger sister of Zionism is racism. And that evolution on campus, and I was 100%, you're 100% right, was in the process of pursuing my own master's in law at the law school. And you could see the beginning of what it would mean for students. The implications, of course, are that nothing remained on campus. It can't remain on campus. People graduate. And what happened on campus for the last 20 years has moved off campus onto streets, into corporations, into Congress. We see the many, many ramifications. And campus students and university students are actually at the forefront of this war, if we accept that description, that has been waged against the very legitimacy of the state of Israel's right to exist as what it was founded to be, Jewish and democratic, that's waging on campuses throughout North America. And I'll tell you the good news and the hopeful piece. The hopeful piece is that when I was there was no such clarity as we have today that anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, that mutation is so clear that we see in the streets of New York just 2 days ago, very, very clearly saying, we don't want no, 2 states, we want all of it. And you saw it and I saw it, because at the end of the day, that's what that mutation has resulted in. And that's when I say the good news, it's not because it's easy. It is very difficult to fight a war. But you better know what war you're fighting and what mechanisms and tools to use in order to be able to not only protect yourself, but rise from the docket of the accused. And that's where I see a great sense of hope in a younger generation of students that's very clearly understanding that the war is not about 1967, and it's not about settlements or no settlements, and it's not about left or right, and it's not about religious and secular, and it's not about Jews and non-Jews. It's about the very acceptance of the state of Israel's right to exist as a member state, as the Jew among the nations, if you will. And in many ways, that is a very empowering moment for a whole generation that is very savvy in the human rights that I spoke about before that have been weaponized, and understand that if you weaponize or appropriate human rights in that way, it's not just Israel that suffers. It's certainly not only Jews that suffer. It's human rights that are actually so blatantly undermined. And so any of us that purely and really are championing human rights, that feel that we are trustees of human rights, which we are, have to rise to this challenge. And in that sense, in many ways, and I think in that conversation we had in Tel Aviv over coffee, I said to you, we have to take back intersectionality. It is ours. It is very important to understand that this is not a Jewish cause. It's not about Israel. It's a human rights cause. And I'm very hopeful in that sense.
You always have such a way with seeing things in a macro level, and really everything you just said was really eye-opening, I think, in this shifting of the situation on college campuses. And you mentioned human rights, and I think this is one of the things that we're seeing that is being weaponized against the Jewish community, against the Jewish nation. And one of the biggest manifestations, the other biggest manifestations of this challenge is at the UN, and the United Nations has an institutional bias towards Israel, and it's something that we can find countless of evidence of it, and I mean the most telling one, I think, is that the UN Human Rights Council has Israel as the only permanent item on its agenda. every year. And I want to ask you if you think that the United Nations is hopeless, or is it still worth engaging with? If there's any tactics that you think, or a strategy that you think the Jewish community and people that of good conscience should take when we're addressing the UN, and if there's anything we should be concerned about with the UN reports that we're seeing and other human rights reports that are related to it. What do you make of all of this?
First of all, Chen, thank you for the very important question. The UN mandated to uphold, promote, and protect international law and human rights is actually and entrusted with the imperative to hold countries to account, hold perpetrators and violators of those foundational principles to account. In many ways, when we speak about the weaponization of international law and human rights, that includes the mechanisms such as the UN. Now, look, we're talking at a critical time in global history, not just in our own history. So Israel as the canary in the mine shaft, and the utilization and appropriation of human rights in the war to delegitimize, demonize, and single out the state of Israel, as I said before, has not only damaged Israel, it has not only enabled this new form or the mutation of anti-Semitism, as we called it, to target Jews all over the world. It has actually, if not collapsed completely, done terrible damage to the infrastructure of the UN, and we see it as we speak. We see it as Russia invades Ukraine. We see it as this continued culture of impunity that is enabled by the very mechanisms, by the very organizations, including, and we'll talk in a minute about Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and their appropriation of human rights to demonize, delegitimize, and single out the state of Israel, and utilize these terrible accusations, or level or peddle these terrible accusations against the state of Israel that not only undermine Israel and not only harm Jews around the world, but actually undermine all those that suffered through those heinous crimes that Israel is accused of, minimizing, stripping of agency entire peoples as we speak. And so the UN is a very important organism to engage with, in that each of the governments that has representation at the UN has to be held to account by its own public. Each of the countries, whether it's the United States or Canada or Western European countries that are entrusted, that are the trustees of these foundational principles, have to be held to account by their voting public. And in that sense, it's a very empowering message to not only know what the human rights violations in fact are in the world, and we very, very sadly see them and are witness to them today, in this very day and age in 2022. Not only do they empower the students we spoke about and the public of those countries, but they demand that we take responsibility to hold those organizations to account, because what we see in fact otherwise is the collapse of that rules-based order that was created, mandated, funded to uphold, promote, and protect those foundational principles that we call international law and human rights. And there are many that have not only violated, including Iran, by the way, as we speak. So we talk about Russia. In the meantime, the regime of Iran, not the Iranian people. We shouldn't confuse ourselves. The opposite, the very same genocidal terror regimes, be it in Iran or, by the way, be it Hamas in Gaza, that's holding its own people hostage, that's violating human rights of its own people, that's funding terror, that's supporting terror. You can't enable a culture of impunity or single out one country, any country, and apply the rules you've created on one country, any country, be it Israel or be it any other country, while closing or turning a blind eye to other violations. And that's where the engagement with the UN, with its institutions, with the trustees of international law becomes extremely important to expose those violations, to expose the continued culture of impunity, and to combat it. And we'll probably talk in a minute, and I hope we do, about the IHRA working definition and how important it is in that combating of what we see and what we have ahead of us.
Yeah, so please, if you already brought it up, let's talk about the IHRA definition and its importance in the work that we're doing. And if it's, do you think it's relevant? Do you think it's really a powerful tool as we think it is?
I'll say, Chen, it's a powerful tool, an incredible resource, and we have to be not only very well educated about it and read the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, but understand that it's a nearly 2 decades result of a democratic process that is a comprehensive definition that enables, much to many people's sort of criticism of it, very clearly, very explicitly, the criticism of the state of Israel as you would criticize any other country, acknowledging the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards, what we refer to as the 3Ds, don't only damage the state of Israel, but undermine the entire infrastructure. Because double standards, again, in applying rules of any kind, actually undermine the entire rule. You can't have rules that are applied only to one person or one country without undermining the entire infrastructure created. And in that sense, the IHRA comes at a very critical time as a very important resource. And I remind us that 37 countries have adopted the IHRA. I remind us that cities, that universities, that sports leagues have adopted the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, but that's just the first step. And I say that because, first of all, in order to identify and combat anything, we first have to define it. And lucky for us, that definition exists, as I said, the result of nearly a 20-year democratic process. But once we've defined and are able to identify and combat, we also have to implement. And there are very many, and we should prepare ourselves, pushback against the IHRA working definition and its comprehensivity, because guess what? We're on to them. So whether it is the understanding that the mutation of anti-Semitism and in its current form as anti-Zionism, the IHRA accounts for that, and whether it actually is much more convenient to, for example, take bits of the IHRA, let's say Holocaust denial, that's a very low-hanging fruit, because if you take apart a definition and you say, you know what, let's say in the hearings that I held in Knesset with some of the digital platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and others, says, yes, we're going to take part of the IHRA, we're going to take the Holocaust denial part, and we are going to utilize that in order to be able to identify what speech should and shouldn't be allowed on our platforms, Holocaust denial being one we will not allow. Well, Holocaust denial is but one piece, and it's a retrospective piece. It looks to the past. That's very easy. And it's not at all what never again means. If I go back to the UN and to those trustees of human rights, never again that we are all committed to is a prospective statement. Never again that only looks to the past without identifying the manifestations of violations of international human rights in the present, whether they be right now in Ukraine as we speak, or whether they be in Iran as we speak, and so on, or in Syria, and so on and so on. The list is incredibly long, very sadly, enables a world of again and again. Instead of looking to the present and the future based on the past, looking only to parts of the IHRA that look to the history is insufficient. And not only are they insufficient, they enable the lacunae in the definition that remain to enable a continued culture of impunity and enable those gravest violators and empower them to continue in those violations, again, undermining that entire infrastructure of the rules-based order. So the IHRA is extremely important, and it's extremely important not only top-down, I spoke about countries and cities, but I also mentioned sports leagues. It's extremely important bottom-up. It's extremely important that we actually begin a simultaneous process so that countries that have adopted or police forces that are looking to identify and combat anti-Semitism can utilize that definition. Lucky for us, it exists as a comprehensive one, and it is a very, very important resource that we should be utilizing and implementing.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, it's not even because I'm biased. I just think it's IHRA is, people sometimes criticize it. Our critics will say that it's limiting free speech, but I think it's really allowing free speech and teaching people how to criticize, how to engage in conversation about Israel that is critical without crossing the line. So I'm a big supporter of this, and I'm completely with you on that. But I would want to shift to something a bit different, but still in the same area. You're coming from an amazing family, and both your mother and your father have been doing amazing things for the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And your father once wrote, and I love this quote, so I'm going to quote him. He said, "Let there be no mistake about it. Where there is no remembrance, there is no truth. Where there is no truth, there will be no justice. Where there is no justice, there will be no reconciliation. And when there is no reconciliation, there will be no peace, which we all seek." He wrote it in regards to one group of refugees in the Middle East, which, of course, you also know a lot about, that has been continuously ignored. And I think it plays an important role within the conversation about the conflict, the conversation around the Middle East and minorities in the Middle East, and with the Abraham Accords and with a lot of the progress that we are seeing that is happening in the Middle East. I feel like this story has been maybe a bit ignored, the story of course, the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. I wanted to know what you make of this community and where we're standing today.
So you're talking about the imperative to utilize the language of rights, to understand, and in many ways tell the story in a way that makes it much clearer to others. 850,000 Jews from Arab lands and Iran were ethnically cleansed. They disappeared. They're no longer there. And everywhere we look in those countries, beautiful histories, some, over thousands of years old, literally disappeared over just a couple of years, if not less. And that understanding, Chen, in the context of what we talked about in terms of double standards and single standards, right? Even understanding that at the end of World War II, refugees and movement of peoples around the world was a part of a global, I'd say, a ramification of that terrible war. Now, if we discount some refugees, in this case, 850,000 Jews, but we count all other refugees, guess what we've done once again? We've enabled that double standard that says everybody else receives refugee status. By the way, we've also singled out one group of refugees, which completely strips them of agency. The only group of refugees that passes that refugee status from generation to generation to generation. And that is, of course, the Palestinian refugees, stripping them of any agency, stripping them of any hope for a better future, singling out in almost a mirror of discounting the refugees, the Jewish refugees, and sort of extracting one group of refugees and giving them this as if it's a super status, where all we've done is in fact strip them of agency, of any hope for a better future. It's very important that we speak in those terms when we talk about the potential of the Abraham Accords that you mentioned, Chen. And I would argue that the pivot from rejectionism to normalization, and I mentioned before, those series of wars, of military wars, of tanks and airplanes against the state of Israel, that actually they didn't succeed. The state of Israel remained with terrible losses. But post 1967, what we see, and in 1967, what we see is the three no's of Khartoum in the Khartoum conference. And the three no's were no to recognition, and no to negotiation, and no to peace with Israel. And the Abraham Accords, and we should not miss this, for all the incredible things that the Abraham Accords represent in terms of economy and people to people and the joy that we've had visiting one another, we shouldn't miss the potential paradigm shift of those three no's in 1967 to the three yeses inherent to the Abraham Accords. Yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, yes to peace, in that order. Recognition of the right of the state of Israel to exist as what it was founded to be according to the Declaration of Independence, i.e. Jewish and democratic, has enabled tremendous, wonderful negotiations that have paved the path to a peace and coexistence that actually paves the path forward for all peoples in the region, including the Palestinians. But we can't just sort of gloss over that first vital step of recognition. I mean, you speak to another individual and you say to them, do you recognize my right to exist as who I am? Because otherwise, how can we talk or make peace? That's true between nations as well. And it's an incredible moment, a real moment, a historic moment that we're living in. I mean, when I welcomed that first delegation into Knesset of influencers from the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan, and it was Hanukkah, it was my own Hanukkah miracle. And I shared that with them. I shared the potential of that paradigm shift, that we mustn't miss the opportunity to not only highlight, but to empower those that understand the potential of that paradigm shift, because that's what gives back agency to the peoples of the region, not necessarily to their leadership that doesn't want that empowerment, that doesn't want to recognize the state of Israel, that continues to pay for slay in the case of the Palestinian Authority, that continues to call for the annihilation of the state of Israel in the case of the genocidal regime of Iran. But those peoples, the Palestinian people, the Iranian people, they have not only the right, but the tremendous responsibility of those trustees of human rights we spoke about before, whether it be the UN, whether it be those organizations entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect, and actually participating in the appropriation of human rights undermines their own responsibility to the peoples that deserve and need their protection in terms of international law and human rights. So the Abraham Accords are a great source of hope. And we must empower and recognize that potential in them, and to continue to engage in that way, from that context, in that relationship, and utilize it as the path forward.
Amazing. And you mentioned miracles, and someone smart once said that to be a realist in the Middle East, you have to believe in miracles, right? So I love that. And as we are reaching the end, I just wanted to ask you one more question, because we have viewers and listeners that are joining us from all over the world, and many of them want to take part. And you mentioned before that it has to be a bottom-up effort as well, and grassroots initiatives are important. What do you think people should do about anti-Semitism in their communities, in their schools, in their wherever they face it, and how we can all be a part of the effort to stop hatred against Israel and hatred against the Jewish people around the world?
So the first thing, really, Chen, and the most important thing, is to know you're not alone, right? It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to speak up, and it doesn't always feel good. And so knowing you're not alone is a really important first step, and knowing that you are capable of not only identifying, but exposing and addressing. And before long, you find that there are 10 other people that you've empowered. It's a very empowering moment. And I see it all the time when I speak primarily to students. It's a very empowering moment to take back your story and say, I am a member of an indigenous people, a prototypic indigenous people, inhabiting the same land, Israel, speaking the same language, Hebrew, reading the same book, the Bible. For millennia, I am a member of that indigenous people. And that doesn't mean that I don't recognize other indigenous people's right to exist, not at all, the opposite. From that place, myself as an indigenous person that returned to an ancestral homeland after millennia of exile and persecution, and I mentioned before, the Declaration of Independence is committed to the equality of all its individuals and minorities in that country, and is the nation state of my people, whether I live there or not. That is a tremendous moment in history that our generation has the amazing ability and miraculous, you spoke about miracles before, that our grandparents couldn't imagine and our great-grandparents couldn't dream of. And with that comes a tremendous responsibility. With it comes a tremendous responsibility to know that not only can we, but we must. And we must in order to not only advance or protect our own communities wherever they may be, and not only to ensure the successful, security of the state of Israel as it was founded to be, but as I said before, to ensure as trustees of international law and human rights, as people who cherish the importance of human rights, in order for us to be able to protect other peoples who may not have the ability that we have. to speak up for them, to give agency to them. And I'll just quote the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, because every time I engage with students, I think of his important differentiation between optimism and hope. And he said the following. He said, optimism is the belief that everything's going to be okay. Hope is the belief that we have to make it okay. And in that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, whereas hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, and a great deal of courage to have hope. And I remind us that our national anthem is Hatikva. And so we need really at a time of, and you quoted my father before, remembrance, but remembrance for the sake of identifying our challenges today and empowering each other so that we can overcome the hurdles of today and tomorrow. And that would be the most important thing for me when I engage not only younger generations, but certainly younger generations who give me a tremendous amount of hope.
You're truly a paragon of being proud of your Jewish identity and speaking out. So this has been amazing, and I'm sure all of our listeners and our viewers are loved it as well. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, for speaking up, for inspiring us all. And please don't stop, because we need you to lead us. Thank you so much, Michal.
Thank you, Chen.
Many thanks for joining us for the first Fresh Look episode. We're so glad you could join us for this incredible interview with Michal Cotler-Wunsh. This was a very informative conversation with one of the most important voices on these issues. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episode of Fresh Look.